Hey everyone, welcome to day two of the Safety Nights Heat Safety Summit. And this session featuring one of our summit sponsors, Eco Online. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to make summits like this free and open to everyone. So thank you to Eco and welcome everyone for day two. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Dan Abatoy. I handle operations at Safety Nights. And with that, we're going to just quickly jump into some housekeeping. If you're new and you weren't here yesterday for the first day, just make sure that your emails are registered. You should have received an email from Crowdcast saying to register your email. Without doing that, you won't be able to utilize the chat, the polls, things of that nature. So make sure you do that if you haven't done that already. And again, that email should be coming from Crowdcast. Secondly, if you have any questions that you might want to ask David and Richard today, you'll notice a question mark icon on the right-hand side of the screen. Feel free to toss those questions in there. And if you see a question that resonates with you and you like, feel free to upvote that question. That'll give us an indication as to how important that question is to everybody. Lastly, if you have any questions at all during the about this week or during this session, feel free to message me here, or I'm also tossing my email into the chat. Feel free to email me about any other questions you have for the summit. Having said all that, let's turn the stage over to the people that you actually came here to see speak. David and Richard, the stage is all yours.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening in Truman Show style. So wherever you're watching or listening to this from in the world now, I hope your day is going to be good. And I hope we've got some things that will be useful for you in the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. So I'm David, and I'm joined by Richard. We're both from Eco Online. We're going to talk to you today about heat stress. And we're going to be talking to the idea that it's this invisible danger that can put workers at risks. And hopefully we're going to give you some valuable thoughts that will help to keep your workers a little bit more safe. Will just help you to recast the way you think about heat and heat stress. So just to introduce myself properly, I'm David Picton. I'm the Senior Vice President of Sustainability here at Eco Online. I've been with the team for about 4 years, and I've led our work on ESG and sustainability and safety as well. So building insights really from the data and the connected technology software solutions that we have with customers across the world on most continents now as well. Previously, I was a Chief Safety and Sustainability Officer, so I used to do this at an operational level as well. And I've been in safety and sustainability for about 15, 20 years now. Richard, I wonder if you might just briefly introduce yourself. I know we're going to hear from you later on, but just so they know who you are and who you're with us.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm Richard. I'm Chief Science Officer at Eco Online. So in that role, I kind of look at the underlying data sets and assumptions that we use and that our customers use. And we have lots of interesting discussions about whether those data and assumptions are correct for the kind of results and inferences that we're making from them. Yeah, my background is in sort of science and data businesses, which have recently been incorporated into Eco Online.
Perfect. Thanks, Richard. Okay, well, diving straight in then, what we're going to cover for you today, we've got an agenda with a fairly tight set of sections. Really, we're going to give you a bit of context and background, just so you can hear and think through what this might be and how it comes together. Some of the areas and stats, facts and figures you might not have seen. And we'll talk about heat stress itself, about the effects and the risks on various people. I'm going to use a case study then to talk about power line workers, and that's something that we've done a specific piece of work on over the last year or so, and it just might bring that to life, even if you're not working in that sector, just to give you an idea of the kind of echoes and facts and figures you might be thinking about. And then Richard's going to talk to you about chemicals in extreme heat. Again, that's based on some work we did last year. So lots of practical things as well as some of the theory and the facts and figures behind it. So hopefully a nice packed session that will be useful for you as you go through. But first, we thought we'd have a poll just to ask you how focused is your organisation on the risks of heat stress, just to get a sense of what you're thinking out there and how that goes. So there should be a poll coming up on the screen, and Dan's going to launch that for us just to get a sense of how focused your organisation is. So just tick one of the answers or choose one of those, and you should be able to see that coming live now on the screen as you go through. Got some of those answers starting to come in now. So yeah, I think so far in the few votes we've got, with people being aware of the issue and taking appropriate actions, are encouraging to see. Not doing much now, but probably respond if the problem becomes obvious. And just give it a couple more seconds just to see if we get any more votes coming through on the poll. Yeah, okay, quite encouraging then. I think people are aware of the issue and taking appropriate action. So that's good. So let's jump into that then and see where we go from there. Okay. In terms of what we're talking about, really, I think it's probably useful just to get us onto the same page in terms of the trends and heat. Why are we focused on this, and why is this such an issue in a lot of cases, really? So when we look at the context and background, one of the areas that's quite important is there was a really powerful piece of work done by the International Labour Organization in a new report last year, looking at the implications, if you like, of heat at work, the implications for safety and health. And there were two particular areas, I think, for looking at it in that context. We're seeing heat stress apply to regions that have not previously been used to high temperatures and struggling with it. And also, due to climate change, those regions which are already facing heat stress challenges are getting hotter as well. So, on a number of different levels, this was definitely worth looking at the trends that areas and organizations might not have been aware of. So as we look at that, the ILO report found that almost 3/4 of workers had been exposed or were regularly being exposed to heat stress at work. But what was quite interesting was to note that the largest rise in workplace injuries that are coming from this heat stress really was in the Americas. And this was an increase of about 33%, so an increase of a third over the last couple of decades. So definitely a problem that's already a challenge and getting worse as well. And if you look at some of the most recent figures, sadly, in 2020, that was the most recent complete figures that the ILO had access to. There were just over 4,200 fatalities. So 4,200 workers actually losing their lives as a result of heat stress. Now, if you couple that, of course, with the fact that heat waves are often linked to other extreme weather events as well, or extreme natural occurrences like droughts and wildfires as well, clearly you can see that this is quite a contextual problem, quite an issue, not just for society and for communities, but also for workers and organizations as well. When we look at that, then looking at some of the areas in which this really creates some significant implications, one of the key takeaways from this is that there is a significant increase, and it's only rising still further, of workers exposed to heat stress. Hence, organisations needing to be well aware of the impacts on their businesses and their people. But what was interesting is to note that this isn't just a consideration for direct workers within the boundaries of our own organisation. We need to think about this into wider context outside into the supply chain as well, because there's an increasing number of regulations, ESG regulations and similar, which can make companies liable for the conditions across their supply chain. And this is particularly applicable in areas like fashion and factories in Asia and so on. So we've got extended supply chains and areas in which supply chain workers could struggle with heat stress conditions. There is a duty of care, some ethical expectations as well, of course, and some of this is wrapped up into supplier codes of conduct for top level buyers to be aware of the conditions happening across their supply chain as well. So it's not just within the boundaries of the organization. Now, some of the work that the International Labour Organization did to show how if you could take improved health and safety measures to prevent the injuries, there's quite a significant business case, quite alone from the ethical considerations and the people thoughts that would be important as well. But you could be looking at $360 billion globally being lost through issues with productivity, income, medical costs, and so on. So quite an extended issue as well, and a rock solid business case to look at this, not just in terms of doing the right thing. Well, taking that a little further, the Atlantic Council did some really quite groundbreaking research in 2021. There was a groundbreaking study looking at the economic and social consequences of this across the US. Now, they were focusing on identifying as a result of that research there into occupational injuries, so injuries related to work, related to heat and heat exposure at work, of something in the region of 120,000 people a year. And they were putting that economic loss at around $100 billion in terms of the productivity that those organizations were struggling with as a result of those occupational injuries. Now, that's bad enough, of course, but when you look at climate change, and we're going to hear a little bit about that later, a little more later, that's clearly set to get worse, and it is worsening. And the forecast at the moment over the next 25 years is that those occupational injuries could be rising as high as about 500,000 people suffering occupational injuries due to heat stress, really, across the US. And in this stage, that would rise, that figure of economic losses would rise to about 500 billion. So that would go up by about 5 times over the next 25 years. So this is definitely an area which is not just focused on in terms of people, but absolutely in terms of finance as well. Now, part of that is really what drove the OSHA to register their heat injury and illness prevention rule in the Federal Register. And that was registered last year. And things are changing rapidly. The expectation here is that employers under that sort of rule would be responsible for creating plans, evaluating and controlling workplace heat hazards, and putting an obligation on them really to put in place the necessary protection steps to protect workers from heat stress and heat injury. And that's out for consultation, of course, and that's set for an informal public hearing in June of 25. But you can see there's legislation specifically around this now coming forward to focus on this issue. So there's some significant impacts. There's some ethical and moral answers, if you like, and also some financial ones. So some significant implications and well worth taking it seriously. So within that, what would we say are some of the effects and risks of heat stress? I mean, if you look at, again, what the ILO is saying, we're just short of 23 million non-fatal injuries across the world. So a really significant issue with excess heat, creating unprecedented challenges for workers. And this is happening in a lot of cases worldwide all year round when you think of the differences between the northern and the southern hemisphere. And it's not just during heat waves and what might be seen as black swan or one-off events. These are actually extended, sustained periods now of heat exposure. And that's one of the first issues I think is worth drawing to attention is a lot of the storms and the extreme weather will get the headlines, and what have you, will get headlines, and obviously published figures with fatalities around that kind of weather. But heat is the leading cause of death amongst all hazardous weather conditions now. And it's worth understanding that's why we often refer to it as the silent killer. And at the head of the show, when we talk this as being an invisible threat and a visible problem, really, it's not as dramatic, but it's much more deadly. So when we look at some of those risks and why that could be a problem, and some of the figures we were talking about in terms of money and health and productivity challenges as well, this really is all focused around the body's ability to control its internal temperature, of course, because it starts to break down, and it can break down really quite quickly, and people can really start to lose their health and lose their concentration. And that then becomes very difficult, of course, for them to save themselves in a case. So that can be a real challenge with lone workers if there's no one around to spot the signs that they are becoming quite ill. Muscle cramps, fatigue, dizziness, nausea, or it really can, in the end, obviously lead to a loss of consciousness and fainting. Now, I was in the military for 20 years, and we had a real challenge in the desert operations, particularly in just getting enough water in and keeping people actually with enough fluids and hydration in them, quite apart from any kind of other threats there might have been in desert operations or military operations. And in case a lot of people actually had some really quite low level, but nonetheless worrying and debilitating urinary infections, kidney problems, cramps, and so on and so forth. So that inability to just sort of keep the body's systems cooling, working well, and blood flowing through, all of this can lead to some really significant non-fatal risks, real challenges which are debilitating. And if you look at what the ILO is saying again, they're talking of figures of almost as high as 26 million people around the world struggling with some form of kidney disease, and in some cases chronic kidney disease related to heat stress in the workplace. And again, that comes right back to that idea of water and hydration. So you can see some of these effects and risks are quite significant, and there are groups that are, of course, much more susceptible to this, most at risk, areas like factory workers and firefighters, construction workers, people working outside, farmers, of course, but bakers, when you think of the oven temperatures and the bakery temperatures that these work in, and of course miners deep underground where you can have some significantly high temperatures. So not just sectors, of course, which put most people at risk, but there's also elevated risks within workforces where some workers have a significant risk from age-related conditions, perhaps, or perhaps if they're slightly overweight or have associated health conditions like heart disease or high blood pressure. So this is a case-by-case basis, and it really just gives us an indication that there isn't one fix to all of this, and there isn't just one way of solving it all, but it can be a significantly complex risk across the workforce. Now, we talk about heat waves and we talk about some of those, and some of the metrics are important just to dwell on for a couple of seconds here, because there's three ways in which we're starting to see the metrics be an issue with heat waves. There's the hottest day, which is rising in many cases. Records are being broken. The frequency of this, they're happening much more often. And of course, the duration, they're lasting for longer. Now, that is enough in a sense to make heat waves a real concern. But the other thing which is really changing and can significantly change the game is humidity. And that's why, of course, in areas where perhaps tropical areas, you get real issues with temperature combined with humidity, the wet bulb and dry bulb temperatures that you may have heard of. And you can find that a temperature issue with humidity can mean that a more humid uh, environment, if you like, a more humid climate can mean that you get real heat stress index problems, which can be up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit lower than it would be in a dry condition, and even more as well. So the body copes better in dry environments because it's able to sweat and it's able to use its natural cooling mechanisms, all of which start to break down when you get humidity. So you get heat stroke and heat stress problems at much lower temperature because of that humidity. And the final thought is, of course, in many areas, this is now happening in regions which were not used to this. They haven't seen this, they haven't got a collective history of this, they haven't got processes or systems in place to deal with heat stress and heat stress concerns. So areas that were previously unaccustomed to extreme heat are now starting to struggle. It was within that context, I mentioned it before, that we had a study phase last year from about the summer during the extreme weather season, the North American hurricane season, and we called it the Situation Room. And we're going to talk to you a little bit more. Richard's going to give you a bit more detail in a second about some of that work. But one of the case studies we did as part of that was to look at power line workers, and we put together a whole range of facts and figures. At the end of the show here, we're going to give you a link which you can follow to go and join the Situation Room. It's free to join and see everything that we've got there. We're producing new content this year, but you can go back at any stage and see the old content from last year as well. So a great source really there of facts and figures. But just to share a little bit with you today, to look at power line workers and see why this might be a particular area that could bring to life the kind of challenges that some workers would face under heat stress. And the challenge here, of course, is not just the nature of their work, but the power grids themselves, of course, are increasingly stressed by those higher temperatures. You've got increasing demands for energy through cooling, of course, and areas like that, but also the physical stress and the effect on the power grids themselves. This could start to lead to blackouts and challenges for some of the equipment that forms part of that system. Now, this was characterized in the heat dome, a particular heat event from a couple of years ago now, just over 3.5, nearly 4 years ago now, in the summer of 21, when the whole of Northwest Americas were really starting to struggle. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, California, Nevada, all the way up into Canada. And there were temperature records broken across many parts of the Northwest US. And in fact, the highest ever temperature recorded in Canada, 49 degrees C or 121 Fahrenheit. Now, as part of this, which ran from late June through to mid-July of 21, there were at least 1,000 deaths that were recorded specifically as a direct effect of that heat wave. But there are, of course, more suspected deaths, many more suspected, where there could have been other conditions or other complications that were involved. But what was interesting is that not only did they see the heat and the issues, particularly around that and associated with wildfires, of course, ironically, there were also floods at the same time from melted snowcaps in some of the regions there. So you can see that point we were making earlier on, that it's not just the heat that's the challenge with this, but the knock-on effects and the overlapping other kinds of issues there could be. And of course, the power demand that leads to more blackouts, particularly across Washington and Oregon in this case. So in this case, a lot of pressure then on those workers, a lot of vulnerability of the grids, if you like. And the nature of the work, of course, makes it particularly hard. They've got unshaded work, often and usually at height as well. Pretty intense work as well, where they're working for long periods without access to air conditioning or water. If this is associated with a storm, and in this case, obviously it was a heat wave, but when their work is associated with storms, those work schedules and the recovery time between them are very much pressurized. So extremely demanding schedules, particularly if that's associated with some of this rapidly changing work where a storm could be followed by a period of heat as well. And of course, the prime issue and the concern is that many times these workers are working alone with limited access to immediate help or someone to perhaps check in on them and make sure that they're okay, or if they do have an issue, how they can summon help. And in many cases, that's why we've developed applications like Stay Safe, which is keeping lone workers safe, a software and technology solution that helps to keep workers in the right health, if you like, by just making sure you're checking up on them and keeping them safe if they do have any kind of an issue. But crucially, with all of this, the best way to address this, of course, is to involve the workforce and the teams in education, engage them in some of the issues, bring some idea of mitigation to try and help them with the effects of heat stress, and of course allow them to give feedback so that they can continue to learn and to teach each other and learn from each other's experiences. And from some of the work we've been doing with customers, that we've put together 6 really simple safety steps, which hopefully you can take away from here. They will all be, when you see them, extremely obvious, that they're obvious issues really, but bringing them together like this with the acronym SCORCH for heat would hopefully just give you something quite memorable that is good for a toolbox talk, or something that maybe you can just use as part of your internal communications as the weather gets hot, and as this could be a real issue, just to make sure that you're avoiding heat exhaustion by taking all the sensible measures and ticking them off, if you like, as a little checklist of 6. So just running through them. The best thing to do is, of course, try to avoid the heat in the day. Now, not always going to be possible, but there is often flexibility enough. So if you can adjust working schedules to either get work done early or get it late, and adjusting for the cooler parts of the day, just avoiding the issue in the first place may be a real issue, and that may be a real success. Now, I remember that from the military, some of the work we did in Cyprus, we had a particular early start, so it was a very early start in the day, but we had a lot of the work done then before the real heat of the day kicked in. So you still got the same working day, but you've got a chance just to avoid those really brutal temperatures. Now, the idea of sunscreen, of course, sun creams, sunscreens, at least sun protection factor of 30 and above, and making sure that it's reapplied. And I think it's important to stress now that there's nothing macho, if you like, nothing brave about not using sun cream. In the modern day, it's actually a very, very difficult decision not to use sun cream. And provide this for workers as well, a good quality sunscreen of sun protection 30 or above. Now, I mentioned this earlier on, this idea of watching out for the signs as well. This is probably one of the most important things, this ability and teaching and constant reinforcement to observe people and look for the effects of heat stress, early signs, early warnings, having buddy systems so that people look out for each other, similar to perhaps sub-aqua diving, where you have a buddy and you look out for them, knowing the emergency procedures as well, but basically having regular training and awareness that people are looking out for the signs of heat stress, and can spot those early signs and take action to help someone, perhaps get them to a cooler place or get them helped. The R stands for rotas, similar to schedules, but slightly different, because what we're saying here is within those schedules of work, what we need to try and do is then make sure that as the temperatures rise, that we're getting more and more breaks, more frequent breaks, in all possible cases, either shaded or air conditioned. If you think of tennis players, when you see them on the court there, they've got an umbrella above them for those breaks between change of service and what have you. So just getting some kind of shade, it could just be as simple as an umbrella. And you'll see increasing in areas like construction, welfare cabins becoming crucial to make sure that people have got somewhere to go during their break time where they can be a little cooler and a little protected from that heat. Clothing is one of the key considerations as well, particularly when we're designing protective equipment or when we're looking at areas in which uniforms or branded areas can be used and provided as work equipment. We really need to be looking at lightweight, light color, loosely fitting clothing, particularly in hot areas. But the idea of wicking and the idea of choosing material which will take the moisture away from the skin and help that to evaporate as part of that enhanced cooling process. This is why products like heavy cotton, for example, would not necessarily be the right thing. You need some kind of modern wicking kind of material which will get rid of that moisture and not leave it thick and hanging to the skin, which will be then a real challenge in terms of the sweat that can be sent out in hot conditions. And of course, hats and sunglasses. Important to make sure that kind of protection is given to the workers. The final step, of course, probably the number one of our 6 simple safety steps is hydration, to make sure that there is lots of water available, lots of drink going in through the day to keep the fluid levels up, avoiding caffeine and alcohol for obvious reasons, because they're diuretics, which will just get rid of the water when you could be using that to keep your blood thinner and cooler. But it's often overlooked in terms of replacing the salts and the electrolytes within the blood system as well, because sweat, of course, produces a lot of salt as well and gets rid of a lot of the natural electrolytes within the body. And that can lead to muscle cramps quite quickly. Even if you've taken enough water, you haven't got the right salt balance within the tissues as well. So Scorch, just 6 simple safety steps. All of them, I don't think anything you won't be aware of there or anything you won't have seen or know to be obvious, but it might just be, like I said, a way of just engaging the workforce and having a quick checklist for team managers, line managers, team workers as well, as you're looking through some of these hotter conditions, just to make sure you're taking those 6 simple steps and doing whatever you can. So that's my first piece really there about heat stress, trends, implications, power line workers, and those 6 steps. And I'm going to hand over to Richard now, who's going to take you through chemicals and extreme heat.
Thanks very much, David. That was very interesting. I was particularly interested in the thing about the power workers, and one of the things I remember when we did that was when you were talking about the clothing, the issue of the power workers often having to wear this very heavy protective equipment to prevent them from suffering from electric shocks, and that being extremely difficult with managing the heat, and combining those two things together. So that's very interesting. Right, time for poll number 2. I'm interested to know, I mean, I'm coming to you from Scotland in the UK. It's one of the hottest days in the year so far, but nothing on the kind of index that we're talking about. But obviously with all the sort of political stuff going on at the moment, I think the questions about whether business is taking climate change seriously is quite interesting in this context. So I'm asking a question about what's your business's position on climate change impacts, and on whether it's taking it seriously enough or not. And I can't see the poll options coming up from where I am, but are they appearing for you guys? They are. Good.
Yes, they are, Richard. Yeah.
And I can't see the answers either. But how are they coming?
What we've got is a couple of votes so far for fully aware and having mitigation plans in place, aware of the problem, working towards a plan. That's the most choices. So most of the choices seem to be being aware of climate change and having mitigation in place so far.
That's interesting. Yeah, good. I mean, what I was interested in, we never know when we're talking to this audience whether you're a representative audience of businesses, and the fact that you're attending this maybe means that you are part of a business that is more enlightened than average. But I suppose it will be an interesting thing to keep an eye on what businesses as a whole do in North America in the current situation when it comes to acting on climate change, either to reduce emissions or to protect workers and to adjust their actual businesses for climate change impacts. Right, I'm going to now share a screen with you to show you just some of the resources that we after showing you this slide, just to show you what I'm going to cover in this section. I'm going to show you a few of some of the pages that we did in the Situation Room, which is this communication channel that we developed last year at EcoOnline. Our first series focused very much on extreme weather, and high temperatures being one of those. We also looked at hurricanes, and what we looked at is how these things are occurring. Are they occurring more severely, more frequently? We also looked at how businesses can prepare in different ways to mitigate the damage. And I'll show you a bit of that content, and at the end of the presentation we'll share the links so you can get access to that. I'm going to show you a live application that we use internally to look at future predictions of climate and what they will do in terms of the maximum temperatures, duration and frequency of heat waves. And then I'm going to just go back to talk about specifically the chemical hazards that are related to temperature increases and heat waves, and talk a bit about those before closing out. So let's see if this screen share works. Hopefully that's viewable.
Yep, we'll come
So
through.
this is a LinkedIn group that we started with the Situation Room that covered different aspects of, as I said, of extreme heat, and this one was particularly this issue came out in October, looking at the chemical the relationships with chemical management and the hazards that would come out there, and what we found is that, well, as I'm sure you're aware, that handling chemicals can be hazardous on its own, but in extreme temperatures those hazards can multiply. And we looked at, in particular, how different chemical storage regimes and the transportation of chemicals could be affected by extreme heat. And I will come on back onto those key points around increased volatility, flammability, chemical decomposition, and the risks of container pressure and rupture, as well as the health risks to people handling chemicals. So first of all, and now I'm going to show you the application that we had to demonstrate how we expect extreme temperatures to increase over time in different parts of North America. So within the page that I showed you, there is a video based on this application that kind of gives a summary. What I'm just going to show you briefly within this application is what it looks like and what the future looks like. A little bit of a loading thing there. So this is our climate change sort of future look product that we look at a whole lot of climate change scenarios into the future for different aspects. And as you know, climate models are not necessarily precise, but they are indicative of what we might expect as temperatures change into the future with increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases. And I'm sure many of you have seen these kinds of map-based products in the past. What we've done with a lot of these things is to put the data onto an actual map so that specific locations, that as you zoom in to a specific location, we can extract the data from these models for a wide range of attributes. And this model contains a lot of public buildings and their locations. And many of these public buildings are schools, for example. And for that, we can pull out the specific types of data that we are. Sorry, that one's not opening. Let's see if we can get another one. Oh, sorry, dearie me. Here we go. So as you would expect, depending on the type of emission scenario that we have going on into the future, we will get either an increased frequency of heat waves. The scenario at the top is one where emissions continue to be produced into the future without a successful mitigation program. So we would, in this particular area, we are looking at a frequency rising from around 4 or 5 heat waves per year to over 12 heat waves per year by 2080. So a threefold increase in the frequency of what we would call a heat wave, and a heat wave being a period of at least 5 days where the temperature is over 5 degrees above that seasonal average, as well as the other aspects of things like the actual hottest day of the year. So that, on the hottest day of the year, we are looking in central North America, we're looking at temperatures where the current hottest day of the year is around 34 or 35 degrees Celsius. It would be by 2080 around at least 40 degrees Celsius. So really significant growth. Obviously, if we are successful at avoiding climate change through reducing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we will have a much more modest increase in that hottest day of the year, and that's what we find in most of these cases. I will just zoom out. So one of the key takeaways that we find from this type of data is that the centers of the continents have a much more pronounced global, or a warming effect than the coastal areas. So when you see and you hear in the media talk about a 1.5 degrees rise, it doesn't sound too much, but that 1.5 degrees is a global rise. What you will see is that there's much less warming, or a much slower level of warming over the oceans and in the coastal areas, and a much greater, more extreme rises of temperatures in the centers of the continents, and that goes across the globe. You'll also find that the northern hemisphere is predicted to warm much more than the southern hemisphere, at least over the next 100 years or so. So that sort of rather sobering view, I hope it's not too doom and gloom, but I think it's kind of realistic that we will be living in an increasingly warmer world, both in terms of those durations and the levels of the heat that are produced. Those things will affect many aspects of the economy and many aspects of society. They will affect things like food production. It'll affect living conditions. One of the other topics that we looked at in the Situation Room was the effect on educational attainment in certain areas, and there is strong evidence to show that in areas of extreme heat, that has a significant effect on educational attainment, the ability for students to concentrate and to do work outside school, and the effect on their sort of ability to progress and develop. So I would expect, it'd be surprising if there were, unless there were sort of really strong efforts in the country to sort of mitigate that, then there will be effects on economic effects filtering through from the result of education and people being unable to kind of achieve things that they would have wanted to in certain parts of the country. Obviously, there's also strong relationships between the level of deprivation and the effect on people. So people in poorer areas that have less access to air conditioning tend to be more severely affected and also have worse health outcomes as a result of extreme heat. So the effects can be quite pernicious in terms of increasing inequality between people and causing sort of economic damage as well as health and safety damage, if you like. Now, just to return, I don't know if is it possible to bring back the slides, but the last few points are just to return to the chemical management aspect, and these are really the points about what happens physically to chemicals. As you're aware, as chemicals the ambient temperature increases, so many chemicals become more volatile, i.e. the gaseous component increases. They also can become more flammable, and they can also start to decompose more rapidly. That has multiple effects. I mean, it affects the way in which they'd be designed to be used. So chemicals are being produced and handled and transported for specific purposes, anything from surface, painting, adhesives, through to pesticides and things like that. So their performance will be affected by extreme higher temperatures, but also their safety issues. And there are certain things that one can obviously do to manage that in terms of safety precautions and handling requirements. But there are also sort of at certain extremes when particularly chemical handling should be avoided. The other key thing with storage is that certain chemicals require cooling, and if cooling fails, there can be explosive conditions can be produced, and so that has implications around things like backup generation and safety precautions that might need to be taken if cooling fails to evacuate places or put in sort of containment measures in those kind of situations. And then finally, there's the issue of if there is a chemical spillage in a certain area, then the effects if that occurs at high temperatures, then that can have an increased effect on the ecosystems, on particularly on water life. The impacts on rivers and lakes could be increased in terms of the toxicity or the vulnerability of those organisms. And the same might go for humans. I don't know. There's a lot of evidence in this, but I think if people are already heat stressed and then subject to sort of chemical toxicity on top of that, that's likely to be a sort of an additional stress on them. So really a set of hazard warnings there, but hopefully along with that that we will also see an uptick in positive practices for chemical management in these kind of conditions. One thing that we did come out on a positive note from our study last year of various hazards under extreme heat was the note that there are certain industries that even when they operate in very hazardous conditions, they have quite good safety records. And these are certain things like the offshore, while there have been some notable, obviously very notable incidents, they have developed safe operating procedures in places like offshore oil and gas. But so it shows that safe operations are possible even in extreme conditions. And just with the arrival back on Earth of the astronauts from the space station, it shows that risks can be managed in very extreme conditions. But yes, we will have to obviously, as temperatures do increase, both in duration, frequency, and extremeness, we will have to take more measures. So that's the end of this session. From the presentation side, I think we've now got time for some discussion in the chat.
Yeah, indeed, thanks, Richard. And I think just while we just look at bring out some of the chat there, just to remind that the Situation Room series that we've taken a lot of this material from is freely available. It's available on LinkedIn. If you look at the Eco Online Global LinkedIn page, you'll be able to see that. And as we said as well, that's content that we created last year. There's about 10 articles from last year that cover a wide range of areas in extreme weather events. And then this year, we're going a lot wider and deeper into other areas of safety, chemicals management, environment, health and safety, ESG, sustainability. So there's new content being built. This current month, we're doing the effects of artificial intelligence. We've got a live panel tomorrow, in fact. And then we're looking at health and safety cultures next month as well. So yeah, lots of new content and insights. Hopefully it'll be useful, connected to everything you've heard today, and the heat stress pieces are there. You can go in and access them from last year. Yeah, and there's a link at the bottom of the screen, I think, if you want to just follow that one. That will take you straight to the situation room, so you can check in with that one. Now, I think we had one question that I saw, Dan.
Yes, we do. So Hannah asks, what are the most common symptoms of heat stress that supervisors and workers should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, it's a great point, actually, because some of them are so ordinary, really, but it well worth being on the lookout for them. That point of observe in the center of that scorch mnemonic that I was talking about, really. I mean, primarily things like headaches. Obviously, one of the early signs, headaches, that perhaps things aren't going well. It's starting to get things like muscle cramps. Some of the areas and concerns around muscle stiffness, fatigue, that can be linked to that electrolyte issue I was talking about as well. You can get sort of muscle cramps as well. It's interesting to note that although workers may sweat to start with, eventually their skin may dry, and they may have just hot, flushed, dry skin, which is quite a worrying sign that at that stage, then the natural cooling process of sweating has started to break down. Perhaps they've run out of water for the body to issue, really, and that's when the temperatures can rise really very quickly. The cognitive processes as well, keeping an eye on people and knowing people as well, in terms of the way in which they might be slurring their speech, or their speech may have changed, or they may be making less sense than they would normally do. So their cognitive, their thinking processes have changed. You start to see them perhaps becoming sleepy. One of the other signs, they could also be unsteady or dizzy, even fast breathing as well. So there's a whole range of symptoms, really, which to look out for. And the important thing being, of course, just to spot them early, so that you can take action to either get somebody to a place where they can cool down, make sure they're drinking, make sure they take a break, everything we were talking about in those 6 simple steps, really. But absolutely, very common symptoms and signs, and early indications and early detection is key.
Great.
Yeah,
So anybody, while I say this, feel free to toss any more questions in the chat, and we'll get to them. But Richard, David, all I can say is, again, thank you for your time. That was a great session. I think we all are walking away with a ton of information. Even just being able to see those models and the predictability of where we're going in the future, I think is a very sobering image that I know I'll be walking away with, in terms of the future of heat and what that looks like for all of us. And so, again, all I can say is thank you. I appreciate your time, energy that you put into this. And unless I don't see any other questions coming in at this moment. But yes, again, feel free, everybody. The link is at the bottom of the screen for the Situation Room. Please take advantage of that. Go over and check that out. And again, Richard, David, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for joining
much,
us
Dan.
today.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
All right. And for everybody, we have one more session today. It's going to be at 1:00 with BJ from Opticare Connect. So look forward to seeing everybody there.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your